Following the failure of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a great shadow fell across the north of England. What had begun as a rising of conscience, an appeal to preserve the ancient Catholic faith, ended in bloodshed. As Father Myerscough records, there followed a wholesale execution of earnest Catholics, men whose only aim had been to safeguard the religion of their fathers and, as they believed, to rescue the king from the influence of those who led him astray. The principal leaders, Thomas Percy and Robert Ascey, were not without a way of escape. Their lives could have been spared. All that was required was submission, an oath acknowledging the king's supremacy over the church, and acceptance of what many held to be his unlawful marriage. Yet they refused. They chose instead to stand firm. With clarity of conscience and fidelity to Christ, they faced death, not as defeated rebels, but as witnesses to a higher authority than any earthly crown. In the years that followed, the condition of Catholics ebbed and flowed. Under Queen Mary, there had been a brief restoration, a moment in which the old faith could breathe again. But this respite was short-lived. With the accession of Elizabeth, the tide turned once more. The Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity reimposed a religious settlement that struck at the very heart of Catholic life. The authority of the Pope was rejected, the Latin Mass was abolished, and in its place was imposed a new form of worship through the Book of Common Prayer. Attendance at these services was no longer a matter of choice. It was enforced by law. Those who refused faced fines 12 pence for each absence, a sum that amounted to several days' wages for many. But the cost was not merely financial. Catholics found themselves excluded from public office, distrusted by the state, and increasingly isolated within their own communities. What had once been the shared faith of the nation was now treated as disloyalty. Enforcement was not always consistent. In some places, penalties were applied lightly. In others, they were severe. But the uncertainty itself became a weapon. No one knew when scrutiny might fall upon them. Fear took root. Neighbors became cautious. Families learned to remain silent. Yet conscience cannot be silenced indefinitely. By November 1569, the strain had grown too great in the north, where the old faith still held deep roots. Resistance once again began to stir. What followed became known as the Rising of the North. It was not, at first, a movement driven by ambition or rebellion for its own sake. Many among its leaders were hesitant, aware of the risks, and doubtful of success. But pressure mounted from those who could no longer endure the steady erosion of their faith. Reluctantly, leadership was taken, and the rising began. For a moment, it seemed as though their cause might prevail. There were early successes. The rebels gathered strength and advanced toward York, a city of great significance. Had they taken it, the course of events might have changed. But uncertainty crept in. Rumors spread. Confidence faltered. The unity required for such an undertaking began to fracture. Meanwhile, the Crown acted with determination. Forces were already in place in the north, and reinforcements were swiftly dispatched. The response was organized, disciplined, and overwhelming. Faced with this, and with doubts growing within their own ranks, the decision was made to retreat. It was a turning point from which there would be no recovery. The rising collapsed not in a single moment, but under the weight of indecision, fear, haste, and betrayal. What followed was not merely suppression, but retribution. The Earl of Sussex, leading the Queen's forces, reported that at least 600 or 700 were executed, not counting those killed in the field or taken prisoner. Other accounts suggest even greater numbers. Across a vast region from Newcastle to Wetherby, it was said that scarcely a town or village was spared. The gallows stood as a grim reminder of the cost of defiance. These were not only leaders or soldiers. Many were ordinary people, men whose only crime was loyalty to the faith of their forebears. They were executed publicly, their deaths intended to serve as a warning. The message was clear. There would be no dissent. And yet, even in the face of such brutality, the Catholic faith did not disappear. It endured quietly, often hidden, sustained by courage and sacrifice. In the years that followed, priests trained abroad returned in secret to minister to the faithful. They celebrated the Mass in hidden rooms, heard confessions in whispers, and brought the sacraments to those who risked everything to receive them. For this, they were branded traitors. To harbor a priest was itself a crime punishable by death. Those who offered shelter, food, or even silence shared in the danger. The penalties were severe, often carried out with deliberate cruelty, intended to instill fear and break the will of the people. But the will did not break. Instead, a pattern was set, one that would continue for generations. The martyrs of the Pilgrimage of Grace were followed by those of the Rising of the North, and they, in turn, by countless others. Together, they formed a living witness, a testimony that the truth they held was worth more than life itself. To the world, this may seem incomprehensible. Why suffer so much? Why refuse a simple oath? Why cling to a form of worship when compliance would bring safety? The answer lies beyond the natural. It lies in faith. To these men and women, the Mass was not merely a ceremony. It was heaven touching earth. It was the presence of Christ Himself. To abandon it would not have been a small concession, but a betrayal of everything they believed to be true. And so they endured. We cannot know the full number of those who died. It may well have reached into the thousands. Many names are lost to history, but their witness remains. Their story is not only one of suffering, but of fidelity, not only of loss, but of endurance. They stood in a time of confusion and fear, and they did not yield. Across the centuries, their example still speaks. The cause for which they suffered has not vanished with time. The gift they defended, the Holy Mass, remains, and with it comes the same call to remain faithful, whatever the cost. For in the end, it was never about power or politics or rebellion. It was about truth. And truth, once known, cannot be abandoned.
They came with papers and called it law. They came with smiles and called it peace. But something was already breaking in the north. Something older than kings. Something they could not name. Under northern skies, truth was hidden in their eyes. Oaths were spoken, lines were drawn, but something sacred still lived on, and men stood still between two ways, one for life and one for faith. We would not leave the altar in the ground. We would not trade the sacred for the crown. In silence, in flame, we stand the same. The ancient fire still calls our name. They took the tongue, Latin buried beneath decree. They dressed the silence up as order. They called it unity. Just bend the knee, just sign your name, and you will live. But what is life when truth is something you are no longer allowed to speak? Empty pews and guarded doors, whispers falling through the floors, hidden prayers in shadowed rooms, faith still breathing in the gloom, and every heart became a place where fear and courage shared a space. We would not leave the altar in the ground. We would not trade the crown. Through hidden nights and silent flame, we kept alive the holy name. And then it broke, not in glory, not in triumph, but in conscience. Men who had endured in silence could endure no more. The North began to move. Banners rising through the gray, hopes that would not stay away. York was near, the path was clear, but doubt arrived and whispered fear. And what was strong began to shake, for every soul had more at stake. We would not leave the altar in the ground. We would not trade the sacred for the crown. Though hope may fall and voices fade, the truth remains, it is not swayed. They hung them in the towns, not for war, not for power, but for refusing to forget. Gallows rising like a second forest, wooden rope where truth was tested. 600, 700 names lost, but not the fire, the mass, the sacrifice, the presence. Touched a hidden space. We would not leave the altar in the ground. We would not trade the sacred for the crown. Through blood and silence, loss and pain, the living truth remains. You can take the altar from the people, but you cannot take the sacrifice from the soul. We would not leave